Have you seen the news yet?" Karis shook his head and stood to come and see the monitor, and stretching luxuriously as he did so. He could feel a number of stiff vertebrae in his spine crack, and he grimaced at the pain but smiled, knowing that small discomforts would mean much less pain later from the buildup of pressure in his joints. It had been a stretch he had taken an entire year to perfect some centuries ago, and he had surprised even himself with how quickly he had picked it up and managed to perfect the action with little to no wasted movement or exertion. His spine followed mathematically beautiful ratios before he finished the stretch, coming to stand behind his mate and look at the boxy monitor. Calzi pointed to part of the flickering screen, and he could see that the article was a news piece about the newly discovered humans. He was surprised that they had gained so much noteworthiness, for they were some of the unfortunate species of sentience cursed with mortality. They were little more than furless bipedal mammals, scarcely evolved beyond lactating, hooting at each other, and fighting in the mud with pointed sticks. In fact, their entire genus hadn't even existed for a clean million years as of the current date, whereas Calzi and Karis's kind could actually count their ancestors back to the formation and cooling of their planet nearly 10 billion years ago. With some amusement, Karis saw that he was nearly as old as the very planet humans called home, their star being a late bloomer in the celestial sense, and everything following being likewise delayed. Indeed, he almost felt a degree of pity for the simple creatures. Such limited lifespans were mere fractions of a blink of a cosmic eye. The scant handfuls of other sentient species and civilizations that littered the universe, of course, varied significantly in their form, function, and longevity, but even the most fleeting of those that Karis had heard of at least counted their lifespans in dozens of centuries. The humans, however, were a mere fraction of that, and it surprised Karis to no end that they had made a civilization at all, let alone achieve spaceflight and interstellar travel. There had even been some murmurings here and there by those who had met the humans and seen some of their culture, that their species was capable of producing not just quality goods, but quality art as well. The notion was patently ridiculous, of course. The development of talent, true talent, took dozens of centuries for even the most menial and trivial passion, to say nothing of more noble and historied works like carving, textiles, or painting. The thought reminded him. Karis stepped over to his latest carving and worked on it for a few days to clear his head before further trying to understand what he was reading. Pondering the article Calzi had opened, he could see that it spoke of humans not just in a curious tone, but in one filled with frustration and anger. Evidently, the humans had colonized a series of empty planetoids that had been identified as being rich in some much-needed minerals for starship hyperjump shielding. Unfortunately, the humans were unwilling to see reason, claiming that because they had landed on, lived, and reproduced on the surface for a mere millennium, they were entitled to set terms for any negotiations regarding what lay poorly utilized and unappreciated below their feet. Calzi returned from the weeding of her arboretum that evening, seeing Karis still reading through, and chuckled. "Yes, I'm personally coming to the conclusion that we may have been overly hasty in asking for their input at all," she said, pointing to a sentence a few paragraphs down that Karis had not reached yet. "They seem to recognize and appreciate the density of titanium, but claim they have no need for it for jump shielding." Karis blinked, stunned for a moment before he burst out laughing. "Evidently they have some desire to put a dent in that seemingly boundless well of reproductive capacity," he said. "The radiation from one trip alone would surely sterilize any of the dumb bipeds, to say nothing of the various cancers they would be inviting upon their heads after a few additional trips." Calzi shrugged, blinking at the rising binary suns. In her eyes, "Yes, well, I guess they see life as more expendable than even we would have guessed," she said as she picked a sprouting clump of soil out from under her claw. "The last bits of the report indicate the humans have threatened combat should we continue with hostilities, but their ships are something built in apparently not even a full human lifetime. The battles will likely be more a matter of swatting some belligerent gnats than a true competition." Karis nodded, turning back to begin truly focusing on his carving. He had spent nearly 1,000,000 years honing his skills on this art form and was barely a score of millennia outside of his apprenticeship classes, but he still believed he had some minor improvements to go before perfecting his art to stand amongst the masters of carving among his kind. Karis had worked with this particular block of soapstone for nearly a decade already, here and there carving in and out. But he believed he had finally begun to achieve the final stages of details as its avian form became more recognizable. Although he was not finished yet, the piece was a constant source of praise for his efforts from all who visited. True, it might not be up to the level of the oldest masters at this point, but it was at least recognized as being among the best of the dozen or so other living sculptors across their species, an annoyingly crowded field due to its popularity. He lifted his chisel and, over the course of the day, gently scraped off another flake. He had barely been carving at it for another year before Calzie's computer let out an insistent beep, alerting her that the digital courier had arrived with a news update. Both Karis and his mate were surprised at another news release so soon, but he could already feel shock rippling through him as his eyes took in the headline and the ominous map beneath it. Humans strike back after mining rig defense. Inflict heavy casualties on both personnel and holdings. Long days passed as they stood in shock. Karis could feel his anxiety rising. Death was a rare and celebrated thing for his species, with lives cut short prematurely due to accidents or violence, mourned to the utmost. And yet here were the names of hundreds of lives lost, enough to depopulate entire planets, all just because some lowly humans had decided not to cooperate. It was stunning to see as well the map revealing the holdings the humans had taken, springing forward like a wildfire from a few mere arms of their home galaxy to now nearly half a dozen galaxies, almost all of which shared a border with Karis's people. It was a surprise move, to be sure, but Karis felt only a small pang of anxiety threatened to creep over him as he looked to find where, on the maps of the contested galaxies, the world beneath their feet lay. Theirs was a fairly urbanized world. There were more than a dozen families on this continent, and twice that number scattered amongst the large islands in the planet's ocean. However, it did lie on the far tip of a galaxy that itself was nestled tens of thousands of light years away from the contested border. "I expect they'll soon get what's coming to them," Calzie said with a derisive snort. "They have no doubt mobilized the fleet, and will soon be showing those humans why slapdash shipbuilding in less than a century is a great way to waste resources and lives alike." Karis nodded but couldn't help but wonder what the humans might do if they were not brought to heel quickly. The next week he awoke from a fitful sleep and began returning to his carving to try to steady his mind. He began to imagine that all was well after a month passed, and then another. But at the beginning of the third, there was another chime that made him and Calzie jump at their midday meal. Cautiously, she opened the message to find a text-only warning. From the provisional government of their small world, a household of bureaucrats and number counters who lived just a few hundred kilometers from where Karis currently sat. It had been nearly 1,000 years since they had last needed to send any messages, but this time their eyes were wide and panicked as they called. "The humans have reached our galaxy," one voice said, gesturing to the updated map. To Karis's concern, the humans were showing as holding a trio of worlds in a pair of systems across the opposite side of the disk of this galaxy. It was hundreds of light years distant, but given the speed at which they had spread before, this likely meant they were mere seasons away. Even so, Karis was terrified scarcely a month passed before the warning chime sounded. For the first time, he had heard it outside of a systems test. He walked over to where Calzie sat, similarly dumbstruck at the computer console. The fuzzy green text on the screen indicated that the automated weapons platforms that protected their world, like so, many others had been engaged. They had detected incoming human craft, those blisteringly fast. A few minutes later, it opened fire upon them. But to their shock and dismay, the weapons platform stopped sending telemetry data less than a quarter of an hour later, suggesting complete destruction at the humans' hands in as much time as it took to say the words. He stepped to the front entrance of their home and looked up. Fire arced through the sky, likely the last few defense platforms being shot down by the human fleet. As for the human ships, they were nearly too fast to see, streaks racing across hundreds of clicks per hour. He barely had time to shout, "Calzie," a brief, fearful look, when there was a sudden rumble and rush of wind and movement. Blinking, still in shock, he saw that one of the human craft had landed. They were the only ones on the kilometers-long street, as was the norm, so he knew they had come for Calzie and him. Karis braced himself for the end, feeling sorrow well up within his heart at the knowledge that he would have his immortality cut short at such an early age. An hour passed, opening an eye cautiously, however, there was no pain, no darkness, no death. Instead, a pair of knee-high humans were standing on their doorstep. They seemed to almost vibrate or phase between poses, but mostly held the same static, curious pose of looking up at them. Karis became aware of a whining buzz in his ears, and after a moment it grew longer and then fell quiet again. Karis just stared, glanced to see if Kalzi stirred, unsure what these humans wanted. The third time the buzz now was much more like a low hum, and he realized he could make out a voice speaking very quickly, too quickly for him to make out the words. Cautiously, he asked, "Are you humans? Is someone making this noise?" There was another blur of movement, the humans' torsos snapping to face each other, and their arms moving so fast they blurred. Then they returned to the previous pose. This time the voice coming through was clearly artificial but understandable. "Hello? There. We are humanity, and we come in peace." Karis felt notably more at ease at the latter half of their diminutive statement, but he was still apprehensive. "Well, if you remain peaceful, you are welcome to enter, I suppose." The words scarcely left his lips when the humans abruptly vanished in a blur. High-pitched whines and buzzes echoed from random corners of the room. He could see the streaks of movement from the humans seemingly ricocheting around the inside of their home. He suddenly felt a regret at having been perhaps too hasty, but before he could speak, the humans had appeared again in front of him, their limbs and heads still showing that same oddly stuttering and ghost-like blur of movement, too fast for the eye to follow. "We thank you for your hospitality," they said again in the artificial voice. "We've been going from colony to try to help correct some miscommunications and misconceptions, but we realize that it may appear startling." Karis just nodded, the flashing, sudden encroachment of humans and the news reports fresh in his mind before speaking. "Well, that is good to hear. But I know there are many of my people, myself and my mate included, who feel strongly and sadly about how many lives have been lost in conflict with your species." The humans abruptly turned, and there was a loud spate of the high-pitched buzz, including an odd chittering noise, before they turned back to Karis and made a gesture of apology. "I understand. True, there have been lives lost that could have been avoided. But it appears that your reports warn of hundreds dead, when I believe the last count was currently 11 total." Karis blinked again, a momentary silence passing before he stammered out, "That is good news indeed. But why did they think them dead then?" The humans looked to each other before turning back to the alien looming over them. "It is customary for our military leaders to disrupt enemy communications. Typically, such a communications blackout is fairly temporary, but that assumes a higher level of skill for counter-hacking. It appears that was an overestimation on our part, for which we apologize. I've already sent communications off to our command to inform them of this and request that the blackout be lifted." Karis was about to reiterate his thanks when the human blurred and appeared beside his carving. "Wonderful work. This is yours, I take it?" the human said, and through the quick gesture, Karis could see the human's head pointed toward the carving, tools he held at his lowest set of manipulator limbs. He nodded. "It is. Were it not for a few blemishes here and there, it might be one of the finest carvings of my generation." The human nodded. "It is beautiful. Reminds me of a sculptor from my own homeworld." The alien nodded politely, but within, Karis was somewhat annoyed by the comparison. The oldest a human could achieve was scarcely past 100 years until very recently, and even then, a century and a half was still the absolute limit. Factoring in the few lost decades for youth and old age, humans had perhaps 120 to 130 years of working achievement they could possibly call upon, while he had spent that long on this carving alone. However, as he watched, the human activated an incredibly tiny screen on their wrist, creating a faint blue glowing rectangle suspended in the air in front of them. From here, both the rectangle's images and the human's limbs became a blur of motion as the human began searching for whatever they were looking for. but it was only a span of a few heartbeats later that the human seemed to settle on something. Reaching over to the glowing, suspended rectangle of light again, the human made a gesture and abruptly the image expanded, ballooning until it was nearly the height and width of Karis's own immense body. The figure was a carving, a man, his face turned slightly. The muscles and detail were perfect, or at least as perfect as Karis could tell. Alongside the image were several zoomed-in close-up shots of various details across the piece, and with each one, Karis felt more and more lightheaded. But it was the final close-up that truly took his breath away. It was of the carved figure's hand clutching a sheet of fabric that bulged and hung exactly like fabric should, rendered with exquisite detail. It was a technique that Karis himself hoped to one day capture, as only one of the master carvers he had apprenticed under had ever managed to achieve such a feat of precision, expression, and carving mastery. The sun had begun to rise the next morning when he finally snapped out of his momentary shock and uncertainly asked, "And this was from just a normal human? With a normal human lifespan?" The artificial voice filtered back. "This? Yes, just a normal human. Most consider him a master sculptor, and he's part of a group colloquially called the Old Masters." Karis did his best to seem nonchalant as he asked exactly how old this old master was, but he could feel a release of tension within his chest as the human replied that the original was something called an Italian from approximately 2,000 years earlier. Doing his best to avoid being rude, Karis stated, Well, 2 millennia is certainly a fast turnaround time for both gaining skill and producing such work, but the skill is to be commended regardless." The human responded with more of the chittering sounds before the voice came back. "Oh, I'm sorry. You misunderstand. The artist, the Italian who made the original, died at 88 years of age." Karis felt like someone had just kicked half his legs out from under him. Less than a century, and they produced that? There's not a blemish on it. And you say he produced this even with him working so far into his old age? Again, more of the strange chittering sounds, and the humans replied, "Oh, sorry, you misunderstand. That was when he passed away. He carved the piece, the inspiration, when he was a mere 26 years old." Karis felt something akin to nausea from the mountain of impossibility that was producing mastery that took 1,000,000 years and a quarter of a century. Less than that even, if one considered that human morphology and strength would likely not permit carving such works until a decade or more into their life. It was astonishing, and yet it still brought a tear to Karis's eye as he mourned. For a human he had never met, who had such beauty and exquisite expression, he had only decades to learn, less than a century to live. Imagine what he could do with an epoch. What sublime perfections could he coax forth under the birth, life, and death of a star? Karis closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to try and calm himself. He opened them, giving the humans in the moonlight a small smile. "It is a shame that he lived so—" He paused, mentally adjusting to the human frame of reference for time spans. "Long ago, as I would have liked to have studied as his apprentice." "Well," said the human after a brief burst of discussion, "it's certainly not the only piece of his that we have, nor the only record of his life. He was born well after the advent of writing and written records. Many of those lessons and his knowledge have not been truly lost." Karis's eyes widened in shock. In his astonishment, he asked, "Might I have a chance to read through them?" "Of course," said the human, displaying bared teeth despite what was clearly meant to be a smile. "On the condition that any lessons you learn, you are willing to teach the next generation as well." Karis nodded, and after patiently transferring the information to his own terminal, he opened up the file on the glowing green monitor and began to read. The initial books and documents he had been given took him a year to complete, an eye blink and drip of nourishment when he hungered for so much more. But then he had reached out, and the humans, now staunch and friendly allies, all miscommunications having been resolved or averted, gladly sent him orders of magnitude more. These, in turn, took several decades to read, still a mere trickle, before he had scraped the bottom, finding the end to all of what humans had written upon the long-dead sculptor. Every work had been committed to memory, every piece of sculpture and painting analyzed and appraised. And if Karis were being honest with himself, all excuses having been exhausted. Finally, he turned back to his block of marble. He had left the comfortable ease of soapstone behind, as he wished to truly challenge himself and prove he was up to the challenge accomplished by a mere human. When he had asked that first human how they did it, doing and creating and living so much in so little time, the human had just smiled and told him, "We are blessed in that the candle that burns half as long burns twice as bright." Karis planned for nearly 5 years, but it was still working, at a breakneck pace compared to the leisurely centuries he had taken before. And so, with a confidence and exhilaration he had never felt while crafting before, he gathered his chisel and hammer. He too could see the angel in the marble, and now he just had to carve until he set it free. Enjoy another movie. Containment. Breach? What sector? The captain asked, quickly pulling down the ship diagram. One section near the aft of the ship immediately flared into brilliant crimson, blinking urgently. That's the cargo," the first mate stammered. "The humans were having us deliver it. We left port not even half an hour ago, and the cargo was still slumbering. They told us it would sleep for at least 2 hours, plenty of time for us to get to port." The captain sighed, recalling the very specific words the pair of humans had used. In a frustrated voice, he growled, "I think they said the cargo would sleep up to 2 hours. A mistake, he realized he had assumed as well. Still, that section of the cargo hold was secured with locked doors and key code access, so he wasn't sure how anything could have escaped in the first place. He stood, flipping the ship to autopilot as he ran for the doorway. The first mate paused, gesturing to their arc pistols. "Should we at least bring something for protection in case we need it? Those should be capable of stunning something with such a large body mass." The captain shook his head firmly. "No. We were told it had to be completely undamaged, or else there'd be hell to pay." He eyed the first mate and growled between his mandibles, "You don't want to find out what terror a human can inflict if they're angered." The first mate swallowed nervously, nodding, and followed behind the captain. They climbed down the interior deck scaffolding, passing cargoes of far less risky, but also far less lucrative field grains and purified Catterall liquor, until they reached the cargo bay in question. There was a slamming sound against the bulkhead, causing both crewmates to flinch, followed by a screech from within. Then the sounds of incoherent screaming and banging footsteps faded. Taking a deep breath, the captain activated the door locks and opened the portal, the first mate nervously, following a step behind. "Here, close up behind you. Make sure it's shut," he commanded. The first mate dutifully did so. They stepped forward, heads pivoting to try to catch sight of the awakened creature. The first mate uttered an oath under his breath. "I thought they said this was supposed to be easy, but they never told us what to do if it woke." The captain nodded. "I have read some stories of humans and their practices, though. These creatures are said to be especially voracious and capable of immense violence and rage if they are hungry." He pointed, and the first mate could see a ration cluster, part of an emergency kit attached to one of the walls. The kit had been torn down and torn apart. The pulp cellulose packaging had been shredded, teeth marks visible where it had been ripped open. The mixed seed and fruit protein bars within had been nearly completely demolished, the foil packaging ripped open. With similar zeal and carelessness, scraps of it left scattered around. The first mate swore under his breath. "By the 3 hives, what manner of beast have we cursed ourselves with?" The captain shushed him. "Now is not the time for regrets. We must be brave and placate it before it causes any more damage." The two continued to creep forward. Into the cargo hold, the sound of crashing and screeching growing louder by the moment. Heavy footfalls could be heard, along with an occasional cackle that made the first mate's blood run colder than it already was. The sounds were punctuated by the crashing staccato of several things being thrown against another, accompanied by cackles of satisfaction, when accompanied by the sound of cracking and shattering of whatever was being struck. The din of destruction caused the first mate to fear what might happen if said violence were applied to a living form, such as his own. As they reached the edge of the hallway, where the crashing, footsteps, and incoherent howling were loudest, it all abruptly went silent. The first mate sighed a heavy breath of relief, whispering to the captain, "Oh, thank my egg. It appears to finally have fallen asleep again. Perhaps now we'll... He paused as the captain held up a hand. This was another important rule, passed along by what I had read of these beings. He looked the first mate dead in the eyes. Silence is almost never a cause for celebration. Sure enough, both their heads swiveled upwards in alarm as a thumping sound came from almost directly overhead, followed by another high-pitched cackle of satisfaction. "It's in the vents!" the first mate hissed. "The diameter is only 20 centimeters square," the captain scowled. "But I suppose now we know how it broke containment in the first place. In any case, we can't fit down there safely. I want you manning the exits to the fore of the ship, and I'll manage those. To the aft. Shout if you need help if it emerges." The first mate swallowed. "Are you sure it's a wise idea to split up?" the captain snorted. "Of course not, but we don't have another choice. I want to minimize damage and ensure the ship isn't left in ruins." The first mate swallowed and nodded before running off to man his post. The captain was right. Their exoskeletons made camped space like the vents effectively impassable. Unfortunately, there were nearly half a dozen exit points on this side of the ship, and the occasional clanks and bumps of movement echoed intensely, making it sound as if the cargo creature was about to burst forth from any of them at any possible moment. Then there was a crash, and the ducks fell silent once more. The first mate finished checking the vents he had been assigned, but as the moments ticked by, he called out to the captain across the comm. "I'm not hearing any movement or sounds on my end, sir. It's possible they may have..." He cut off as the ship abruptly lurched and the captain nearly screamed into the communication badge, "The engine room! They're in the engine room!" The first mate sprinted back across the interior scaffolding, cursing his relative unfamiliarity with the vessel. He realized there must have been a vent exit, not fore or aft, but midsection, into the engineering compartment of the engine room. He reached the doorway at the same time as the captain. The captain motioned for them to slow and be cautious. Acknowledging this, they both peeked around the corner. The creature, which the first mate now saw awake for the first time, stood on stumpy bipedal legs and smashed a broad limb across a display console. The lit-up buttons flashed in alarm, emitting beeps and squeaks of warning about the abrupt changes in engine pressure and power levels caused by the random commands. "How should we distract it?" the first mate asked. The captain shook his head frantically, making a quieting motion, but it was too late. The creature turned, red eyeshine freezing the first mate in his tracks for a brief moment. The reflection of light in the back of the creature's eyes sent a shiver down the scales on his back, as some part of him recognized the look of an apex predator. Then the creature bounded over to him, squat bipedal legs moving faster than he would have thought possible. It grabbed him, lifted him up, and shook him side to side with such force he thought his head was about to be shaken off his shoulders. The creature howled in triumph, and a fat hand grabbed the top of the first mate's head, squat fingers starting to apply pressure. He felt immense pain as he realized the creature was attempting to pull his head off. The creature was scarcely half his height, but the muscle mass difference must have been immense. He felt powerless to stop it despite all attempts at thrashing and pushing himself free. Then, abruptly, the creature stopped, cooing in curiosity as the captain held up a pocketed protein bar. "That's right. Just let him down gently. There, that's a good human." The first mate blinked, his compound eyes watering from the pain, as the creature abruptly tossed him against a wall, roughly discarding him. It stepped forward on all fours for a moment, then stood up on its hind legs again. It took the protein bar from the captain cautiously, made another coo of satisfaction, then stuffed the entire thing into its mouth and began chewing with gusto. The first mate sputtered, rubbing his neck as he crawled over to stand weakly beside the captain. "The hell do you mean, good human? That's a human?" The captain nodded. "An adolescent one. But yes." The first mate looked at the creature, smaller than the humans they had negotiated with for the short jaunt and delivery, and of vastly different proportions, but nevertheless possessed of an absurd degree of speed, strength, and seemingly malevolent intelligence. "I think now I understand why humans are so feared if they grow up from something like that," the first mate said. The captain nodded solemnly as the young human noisily finished eating the protein bar. He stepped over to check the first mate's neck as the crewmate winced, hissing softly. Looks like you'll be all right. Possible strain, but nothing's broken or cracked. The first mate nodded in relief, but then the scales on the back of his neck stood up in a prickle of fear as he looked up. Captain, where'd the human go? The captain looked around. The only trace of the human was a trail of protein-coated grain crumbs leading towards the open vent hatch, a hatch that was more than halfway up the opposite wall to the first mate's disbelief. A cackling giggle echoed through the vents. As the captain frowned, another sound echoed through the halls, an automated voice saying, "Welcome to the bridge." Eyes wide, both of them began sprinting for their lives toward the front of the ship. As they ran, the captain quietly repeated to himself, "It's only another hour. It's only another hour. We just need to survive one more hour." Thanks for diving into this story with me. Don't miss out on the next one. Hit that subscribe button. Give this video a big thumbs up and drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think.